Sure enough. I was thinking that, I mean, there were guerrilla tactics in Portugal, but they worked more against the French.
They were against the French, yes. The British never did suffer. Wellington was very frightened that once he got into France in 1814, that he would suffer from such tactics. And one way he prevented it was by making sure, absolutely certain, that everything they took from the French, I mean, every loaf of bread, every skin of wine was paid for. And if you didn't, you were hung on the spot, and his men knew that. And in fact, he never had any trouble from the French at all, simply because everything they did was paid for. Even if it was a shelter for a night, it was paid for. There was a scale of prices for everything. He was an extraordinarily clever man.
He was.
He was actually asked to come to America in 1814, and there's a famous letter in which he wrote, I think, to Dundas, and said, you can't win in America. You'll never win in America, simply because, you know, so if I capture all of the middle Atlantic states, you know, you still haven't got America. It's too big.
I didn't realize he'd ever, so he never participated in the final battles of that war from 1812 to 14.
No, he had nothing to do with
Europe,
no,
right?
he stayed in Europe, yes. Well, he was at the Convention of Vienna, the Congress of Vienna. So that's, immediately after 1814, after he'd beaten the French at the Battle of Toulouse, he then became the British ambassador in Paris, where he picked up Pauline Bonaparte's wonderful house, which is still the British embassy there. And then he went off to the Congress of Vienna, and there's the famous moment as he rides from Paris to Brussels on his way to Vienna. That was the way he decided to go for some reason. He comes across this crossroads in a very shallow valley, and he makes a note of it and says this would be a good place to fight a battle if the French ever come north. And of course, a year later, that's Waterloo. So he was at the Congress, and he was at the Congress of Vienna when the news of Napoleon's escape came.
In Portugal, Britain always had some interest, at least, in the wine trade. I've been to Bristol and visit, you know, I guess it's Harvey's, the famous sherry people that have a museum in Bristol to remind you of all those ties. During this long struggle, I gather that the Portuguese wine trade maybe was a little more important because the French wine trade, all the smuggling was
the Portuguese wine trade became important to the Brits long before that. I mean, it goes back to really the 14th century. When the English lose Gascony. Remember, the Gascony had been English virtually since the 11th century. And when France finally throws the English out of Gascony, so suddenly we can't get Gascon wine. But Portugal always was England's oldest ally, so they have to send wine from Portugal instead. And Portuguese wine tended to go sour on the journey, so they discovered if you added a bit of sugar, it lasted better, and thus was port invented. And the English then went to Portugal basically to make port, and to this day the great port lodges in Oporto are English owned. There's a couple that are owned by the Portuguese, one by the Germans, but I think 7 of them, you know, Sandeman's, Taylor, Fladgate, Coburn's, they're all still English owned. So the English have been, there's been an English sort of group of wine merchants in Oporto really for about 500 years.
And that figures into
And that's in Sharp's Havoc, yes. I mean,
Right.
it gives me a daft English girl who can get lost. So Sharp could put on his white armor and go and rescue her.
What about Marshal Soult? How is he? Was he one of Napoleon's greater marshals, greater generals?
Probably, yes. I mean, yeah, he was. It's difficult to sort of rank them. Massena was good, Soult was good, Ney, the bravest of the brave. But you know, they all come up against this immovable object, which is called Wellington. Which is why, of course, on the eve of Waterloo, and they are warning Napoleon, who's never fought Wellington, and saying, "Be careful, be careful, be careful." And Napoleon looks at them and says, "You're frightened of him because you've all been beaten by him. But I tell you, he's nothing. He's nothing but a sepoy general," meaning, you know, he was good in India. Well, he lost.
Indeed, he did. You were writing another series about Nathaniel Starbuck.
Yeah.
And I, having visited your website, was interested to see that you commented that one reason you've sort of put him in the closet for the moment is that there were some similarities in the two series, and it made more sense to pursue, after the television, the shorts.
Well, yeah, no, it was the television. I mean, I was actually quite happily writing Starbuck, who I enjoy, and Starbuck, of course, is the American Civil War.
Right. And there are, what, 4 books?
There are 4 books, I think, or 5.
I wrote them down. I can tell you what they were. There were actually 4. Rebel, Copperhead, The Battle Flag, and The Bloody Ground.
The Bloody Ground, yes, which is Antietam. And then, of course, along came in Britain the Carlton television series of Sharp, and it's obvious at that point that new Sharp books were needed rather than new Starbuck books. So I went back to Sharp. That's when I began the Indian Sharp books, with Sharp's Tiger and Sharp's Fortress and Sharp's Triumph. And somehow I've never got back to Starbuck. I mean, I thought I'd finished Sharp, and then suddenly I'm starting, as I said, this second series. And the second series is still running. And I get lots of letters saying, please, when is Starbuck going to march again? And the answer is I don't know. Probably when Sharp ends. But I write 2 books a year. I don't really want to write 2 battle books a year. It's too much alike.
Sure. You have written, however, some other interesting trilogies. You yourself seem, or do you, like the Arthurian cycle, also called what, the Warlord trilogy?
Yeah, the Warlord trilogy.
And that is King Arthur. That is actually...
Well, he's Arthur, yes.
Yeah, the Winter King, Enemy of God, and Excalibur. Why does that appeal to you so much?
Well, I mean, I grew up in England. I'm now an American citizen, but I grew up in England. And anybody, I think, who grows up in Britain knows that Arthur is at the sort of taproot of their history. Or certainly they're somewhere in the root. I mean, I also wrote a book on Stonehenge, and maybe that's right at the bottom of the taproot. But the Arthur books are incredibly important to Britain, the Arthur legend. And I suppose I've lived with it all my life and always wanted to write it. But because I mean, lots of people want to do that. I think if you do that, you've got to at least try and bring something new to it. And what I tried to do with the Arthur books was to create a 5th, 6th century background that was absolutely realistic. And then onto that to project a figure and his companions. And although you never actually saw the full legend, you saw the genesis of the legend. So there was no sword in the stone, but there was a sword and there was a stone, and so on. And yeah, they're my favorite books. They're the 3 I most enjoyed writing and still look back on with most pleasure. What
real character, did you use as something of an inspiration for the Arthurian? Was there a warlord, a real one?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I know there were a lot, but which one for you?
Arthur was the warlord. The first mention of Arthur in any sort of written source is a guy called Nennius. And Nennius, who is writing much too late, frankly, to be a good source. I mean, he's writing at least 100 years after the time of Arthur. He never calls him a king. He calls him a dux bellorum, a leader of battles, which is warlord. So Arthur was... A very strange thing happened to Arthur. I mean, in a sense, he's become gelded. I mean, this is a man, if you read the early Celtic saints' lives, he's a villain. He's a robber, he's a rapist. He's called the Red Ravager. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a fearsome, frightening man. The very first mention of him anywhere is in the famous poem called Ygodothin, which is a story of some Brits coming down to fight the Anglo-Saxons at Catreth, which is now Catterick. And they describe a warrior and how many men he kills and how fearsome he was. And that particular verse ends, but he was no Arthur. So Arthur is a warlord, he's a fighter, he's a warrior. And his fame probably came about, nobody really knows. We know very little about Arthur. We have to sort of tease little things out from the record. But I think that he was the British leader at a battle called Mount Badon. And Mount Badon was important because it was the one battle that the British won against the English. This is all taking place against a background where the English, the Anglo-Saxons, are coming in from the east and they are taking the land. And they're taking the land from what is now the Welsh. And the Welsh name for England to this day is Lloggia, which means the stolen land. The lost land, Lloggia. Arthur was the man, I believe, who stopped that process for a period, just for a time, maybe for one generation. And we know that Mount Badon happened. We know that there was a leader there, a British leader, but we don't know his name. But Arthur would certainly fit. He's never called a king, not until much, much later. It's not about another 400 or 500 years after Arthur that, in fact, suddenly he becomes a king. And my belief is that he is what Nennius says he was, a dux bellorum, a warlord, and not a king. But there were so many kings. I mean, kings were 2 a penny then.